Welcome back, everybody. I'm Julia Sun, my guest on this lovely summer day, author Alyson Richmond. She's the author of the book, The Secret of Clouds. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Julia.
Yeah, now I want to talk about you first, and then we're going to get to the book, obviously. Meanwhile, we want to hear from all of you. We take questions on social media, so if you have any questions for Alyson, just like all our authors, please write them down, and I will ask her. You sort of have an unusual childhood. You lived at many places. Your mom is an artist. Your dad is an engineer. Mm-hmm. First of all, when did you know you wanted to become a writer? When did you want to become an author?
Well, to be factually accurate, I think I wanted to follow in my mother's footsteps and become a painter like she is. I always loved art. I always had a pencil in my hand or crayons. I was always drawing and painting. And it wasn't until I was in college and I took my first art history class, and all my professors told me that I had a gift for telling the story behind the painting. You know, with art history, you're putting the painting in historical context. You're examining from a psychological perspective of artist and muse. I love fashion, so seeing what was in fashion and how a subject might have been dressed at that time period was really interesting to me. And also just sort of unearthing all those layers that go into creating a painting. So I truly did see that there was a story on the canvas. So I started to think when I was in college, could I create a career in which I could write novels that examined the artistic landscape, that perhaps, I used language the way a painter uses paint, to move you through a story through very, hopefully, visual, rich language. And then to just infuse novels with everything I love, creative process, history, questions that I don't know the answer to, all those things. And to, hopefully draw you into a world that you can see, that you can touch, that you can feel, that you can smell, all those, sensory rich things. So you did mention that I had lived abroad, because I did live in Japan both in my high school years, and then I returned for my junior year in college. I apprenticed myself to a Japanese no-mask carver, which for those readers who don't know what no theater is, it's a very ancient form of Japanese theater that requires wooden masks to be worn by its all-male the actors that perform it on stage. And the mask carver actually believes he's infusing the spirit of the actor into the mask, and when the actor puts it on the face of on his face, he releases that spirit to the audience. So I became very intrigued by how I had been a Western woman studying a traditional Japanese art form. When did the reverse occur? When did the Japanese first start studying European art? And that became the basis of my first novel, The Mask Carver's Son. I actually wrote a novel about a Japanese artist who travels to study with the Impressionists. That one incident of living in Japan opened up actually my whole sort of literary, landscape.
Now, longtime viewers of Bookstr, they know I still do host a travel show on this very channel, and I always believe that reading and travel, they go hand in hand. So it's writing and travel. It's just, you just can't go wrong with going to more places. For you in particular, how did that change the way you write? Just because, let's be honest, not every author has the luxury to study abroad, especially in Japan is not a cheap country.
No, it's certainly not. It's probably the most expensive.
And Japan is pretty far away. I do know it's probably easier just to hop across the Atlantic Ocean to go to England or France for a semester, but go to Japan or one of the farther away country, it's harder. So for you, how did that
happen? Yeah. Well, first I should say that when I had this, I did do a junior year abroad, but when I started writing The Mask Carver's Son right after college, I applied for a grant, and that grant enabled me to finance to travel again to Japan and to Paris to sort of research that novel. But I believe I don't want to sound like you have to travel to places, but I love traveling to where I'm writing about. Almost all of my books have taken place in countries other than the United States. Actually, The Secret of Clouds is my first that takes place in the United States, but they're flashbacks to Ukraine. But I love learning. Like for me, writing a book, part of it is I'm writing about, things that I don't know and that I want to learn more about, and then infusing that into my historical fiction. So for me, there's that duality between outsidership, not being from that culture and seeing it from the outside in and trying to learn about that. That certainly sort of echoes back from my first time being in Japan when I was 15 years old, and I didn't initially speak the language, and no one believed I was Japanese. I'm 5'9" with red hair. I look like a big booty, crazy Muppet walking down the street. But I think that thirst for knowledge, to understand another culture better, to want to know the food and taste it. When I travel, I like to even look at, the bone structure of, the face in Finland. How is that, different than Norwegian, and to look at those fine details and to be able to describe it to my reader. I think travel is essential. I think eating the food is really important.
And by the way, you can say on this show you have to travel, right? Because some of our viewers, they aspire to be novel. They want to write novels, and they're all avid readers.
I think the savvy thing is finding a way to finance it. And as I said, I did get a grant to study for my first novel, and then after that, I used the advances from my books to finance then the research for the next book. I'm working on a book now that takes place, has flashbacks to Vietnam. So that's, definitely I'm not traveling with my children this whole summer because I'm saving money to do that big trip. But I want to go there and I want to see it, and then I want to recreate it in the pages of my novel.
Okay. And I have not read this particular book, and to be honest, I haven't read any of your books, but from the three that you just described, they talk about Japan, talk about Vietnam, talk about Kiev, Ukraine. Any of your novel taken place in the more, I don't know, do you have a thing for developing countries that are more remote?
Well, this is, The Secret of Clouds is my 7th novel. So I can say that I have a novel that's about a cellist in the Italian resistance during World War II, and I had to travel to Portofino and to Verona and Mantova and Venice and all the places in Italy, which was probably my most favorite book to research. I have a book called The Lost Wife, which is about how an artist survives the Holocaust because of her artistic skill. And that novel takes place in the Czech Republic. Obviously, in World War II, it was called Czechoslovakia. But there's 2 timelines, both present-day New York and also flashbacks to Czechoslovakia during World War II. I have 2 books that took place in Paris. So I love going back to France and to doing the research and eating way too many croissants. And then I have a book that took place in Chile and Finland and Sweden. And so, traveling to those places has been wonderful as well.
Out of your list, my favorite place, I've been to all of them, I might have loved Prague the most. Where was your favorite?
So I think Italy. I feel like even though I'm not Italian, I always joke that I was probably Italian in another life. It's the place I actually feel most comfortable in. When I'm there, I think this is where I belong. And I keep on saying to my husband, it's 15 years till you can retire, and we have to retire in Italy. But I do love Prague. And I actually, I have affinity for all the places I've traveled to. There's something about them that, you carry a seed of those places back with you. And as you write that book and it sprouts into the pages of your novel, I think, you become rooted to that place in a way as well. So for me, again, writing is sort of, I don't want to say a spiritual journey, but a journey for me in which I am enriching myself and learning more with each book. And I think the most wonderful thing about being a novelist is that you, as I said, get to learn something through the pages of my novels.
I have heard that before, that it's a spiritual journey from other authors who have been on the show. So you're not alone.
Right. All my books begin with a question I don't know the answer to. I often say that when I'm speaking about them. And by the last page, when I've written that last sentence, I've answered the question that initially sparked that novel. Okay. So it is spiritual because it's, that question inspired, years of work.
Mm-hmm. And then really quickly, you're an American after all, right?
Yes.
Where did you live in America? You went to Wellesley College, that's in suburb Boston, and you're also New Yorker, right?
Yes.
So tell us about that.
So I grew up in a very small town on the North Shore of Long Island. It's actually the backdrop for my new book, The Secret of Clouds. St. James. Its claim to fame was the longest running general store in the United States, and it's a very bucolic and quite lovely place to grow up. Not at all like, it doesn't have the energy and vitality of New York City, but it's certainly close enough a train ride in. So I lived there until I was 15, and then we moved to Tokyo. I moved back to Long Island after 9/11. I had been married 5 years. I hadn't yet started a family, but was thinking about it. And I was working on my third book, and I thought, now I want to go back to a place where I can really enjoy the four seasons, look outside my window and draw inspiration from the landscape. So I live on the North Shore of Long Island again now.
Okay. And we have a few questions from the audience, which I'm going to take in a second. But since I never read this book, tell me, what is this book about?
So The Secret of Clouds is actually my first contemporary novel, although there is a thread of history that runs through it. It was inspired by a friend of mine who is a teacher, a third grade teacher, who every year assigns to her class to write a letter to their 18-year-old self, and to write on that page what their hopes and dreams are for themselves and how they imagine themselves when they're young adults. She then asked the children to fold the letter, self-address it to themselves, and on the back of the envelope write a letter from the past with a message for the future. And then she collects the letters and she holds on to them for over 10 years until that class is about to graduate high school. And then she puts a stamp on them and mails them back to the children. So on the week they graduate high school, a letter arrives in the mail written in their, 8-year-old's hand, describing how they imagine themselves to be on the year that those letters arrive. So I became sort of fascinated with this idea that my friend had created a assignment that didn't end that day or even that week, but really, or even that year for that matter, a decade. And I was amazed by this sort of, not only her foresight, but her dedication. The foresight is that she was creating a time capsule for their innocence and how they imagined themselves to be. But then the writer in me became very curious of, well, what happens in a decade of a life of a student and also a teacher? And did she ever have an incident where something happened with one of the letters? And she's been a teacher for 20 years. Did she ever have something happen to one of the students? And I began to ask her, a lot of questions. And one that sort of stood out in high relief was a story that she shared about a child who she was called in to tutor, who was too sick to go to school, but she still gave him the assignment anyway. And what happens a decade later with this child's letter. So writing a book, I think, is really interesting and this, I think, is the artist in me, showing it from different perspectives, different directions, and revealing something new. So The Secret of Clouds is not just written from the perspective of the teacher, but also a young child's life who is too sick to go to school, but who leaves a lasting impact on this teacher. And I decided to weave a bit of history in it, since I've always had history in my novels. And I have the little boy Yuri, who's in the book, be the child of Ukrainian immigrants who come here after Chernobyl happened. It's kind of like crazy now that Chernobyl, this series on HBO, is going on. So, because when I was writing this novel, so few people ever talked about it. I myself had learned about Chernobyl because I had a babysitter who had been a nurse back in Ukraine after the accident happened, and had told me that for the 3 days after the accident had occurred, everyone in Ukraine thought they were having unseasonably warm weather. So when it would have been normally 50 degrees, it was in the high 80s, and they were all outside sunbathing and swimming in the river, and no one knew that years later there would be the impact on their health.
Have you ever been to Chernobyl?
I have not.
Okay.
I have not. That's one place
That's on my
visit.
list. That's on my list.
So
now it's safe.
I kind of, as a writer, it's almost like you're a cook. You're pulling from all different places in order to create something that's, interesting, flavorful, and palatable. And so it was this teacher who inspired me, this sense of using the structure of a decade between a teacher having a student in her class and what happens, a decade later when she mails the letter, but also bringing in history on what the student's background is through his familial background.
I mean, I think that's just a good thing to do in general.
Yes.
Write a letter to yourself today.
Yes.
Address it to
Yes.
your 10-year later
Exactly.
self and say, hey, these are the things I
yes,
want to do with
yes.
the next thing. I thought it's a good
No,
practice
it's great.
anyway,
Actually,
no matter at what age
The
you
Secret
are.
of Clouds was just in a subscription box through a Scribbler box, and they included a letter to write to your in 10 years to yourself about how you imagine yourself to be. So it is a great exercise to do and to sort of visualize and project into the future of what you hope to accomplish.
Okay. All right. Our first question: if you could dream, if you could dream of a cast and a movie adaptation of this book, how do you envision it to go? This is from Don't Lie.
Okay. So I think Emma Stone would be great as Maggie, Jennifer Lawrence too, just because both of them have the sort of upbeat, vitality that I think my young teacher has as a character. The boy, Yuri, is 12 years old, and I think, I hopefully I'm pronouncing his name right, Justin Tremblay, who was in Room and in Wonder.
Yeah.
He would be a wonderful Yuri. And the character of Susie, I think Melissa McCarthy would be great. And let's see, for Daniel, who plays Maggie's eventual love interest, I don't know who that would be. He's sort of inspired by my husband, so I don't know.
What does your husband look like?
He has dark black hair and green eyes, like curly black hair. So a young Rufus Sewell. Rufus Sewell would be too old to play the character in, but if we can go, okay.
I love Matthew Morrison.
Okay, that would be good. Okay, we'll take Matthew Morrison.
Okay, and then from Becky, each of your books is set in a different time period, like you said, or they involve like a certain historical event or figure. Who or what are some historical figures / events / periods that you would like to explore?
That's a great question. So,
great question, Becky.
That's a great question. You're really challenging me. So I have an idea for a Civil War novel that has been in my mind for quite a few years now, but it involves so much research that with 2 children, it's one of those things where I feel like when I have at least one out of the house, it'll be easier to dive into that novel. But that's definitely something that's on my list to do. I also am probably after my Vietnam novel going to be working on a novel that spans Italy and Argentina from the years 1930 to 1970. Couple reasons why, Becky, because your question's so interesting. I recently went to Buenos Aires and I learned about sort of the deep historical connection between Italy and Argentina, what I hadn't known before.
Between Peru and Mussolini?
Exactly. But also there was a fluid immigration between those 2 countries. And there's a beautiful opera house in Buenos Aires that has a secret balcony where they put a child's choir there, and so when there's certain operas that when you hear the children that you can't see singing, it's almost like angels are singing down onto you. And that image was so profound that I immediately saw a scene. Also at the base of the opera house, there are these small iron grills where they were called widow boxes, where women had to, if they were in mourning, they couldn't be seen in public, so they wore black underneath the grills. So this idea of up and down and who was listening and who was singing was intriguing. So I have an idea to involve a musician and someone who might have been in a widow box and then spanning into Italy during that time.
Just so you know, I'm putting this out there super early, but if you ever write that and that's adapted into a movie, I would love to play Ava.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I'm glad you're calling on that now.
Thank you. I'm going to put it out there right now. From Tiffany, what is the one piece of advice that has helped you throughout your career?
Well, that's a great question. So there have been many times in my writing career where I thought, is it really worth all this anguish and this stress to go through a book and to hope that people are going to read your novels? And I have a dear friend who's also a writer. Her name's Jardine LeBaire. And she once said to me, well, why don't you try and see if you cannot write? See if you can do it, because it is such a difficult life. And I didn't last more than 3 days. And what I realized writing, that writing is so much a part of who I am, and needing that release of what's in my mind and how I see the world, putting that down on paper, that what I discovered is that it's really, I write for myself. And I've never been an author who is going to be dictated by what's in trendy, or what is going to necessarily sell. I mean, obviously, I know to sustain myself in this business, I have to sell books, but I am motivated to write, which I'm drawn to, and also what I want to learn more about.
Okay, because there is a difference between writing your diary and writing something that you're
but because it comes from an
novel.
Intellectual curiosity, I feel that by the end of the book, as I had mentioned before, I have learned something. I can quantify that I have that marathon, that journey to get to the last page, I am richer in knowledge than I was before I began writing that novel.
And speaking of writing from Sasha, what's a genre of fiction you'd like to try your hand at next, I assume? Yeah.
That's a great question, too. So I have no interest, I'd have no talent to be able to write a thriller because I don't think I could do it.
Yeah.
I think it takes a really great plotter and someone who can, create a tremendous amount of tension, dark characters. It's not my talent. I'm much more for the descriptive, historical novelist. So what would I think I would like to do a young adult book. I think, for not too young, but between, let's say, 12 and 15, I would love to challenge myself and be able to do something like that.
Okay. And then from Sean, you said your next book has flashbacks to Vietnam. Can you give us a little bit of scoop?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for showing an interest in it. So this new book I'm working on has 3 characters: a Vietnamese war child, a refugee child that arrives in the United States in the early 1980s, an Irish immigrant who's in her 40s, and a Vietnam veteran, and how these 3 lives collide and help each other heal from previous traumas. So again, because my mind works in the way I would be either sculpting or painting and looking from all directions, I wanted to show Vietnam not just from the perspective of a war child, but also the perspective of a veteran. I found that interesting, and how these two, an unlikely friendship occurs between this man and this child, and that inevitably help each of them heal from trauma.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen books that are written not from that perspective. I haven't seen anything, majorly impressive from that perspective. So it'd be great if you come up with something like that. From ES, do you read a lot of historical fiction yourself?
I read a lot of literary fiction. And I love historical fiction, but what's tricky is that I don't like to read historical fiction that has anything to do with what I'm working on myself, because I don't want it to impact my voice or to subconsciously copy anything. So I really have sort of a strict boundary of not doing that. Right now, for example, this Vietnam book, I'm not reading historical fiction that has a Vietnamese theme. I'm reading Vietnam veteran memoirs, war refugee child memoirs. I'm reading as much nonfiction rather than historical fiction, because I feel it's how I take those facts and abstract them and create something new. That's going to be an original piece of fiction. Okay.
I mean, it sounds like you know yourself, you know your writing process well, so you are saying, hey, if I read too much of this genre, it's going to subliminally affect how I work, and I don't want that to happen, so I don't read it.
What I'm drawn to reading fiction-wise is fiction that actually awes me on how beautifully it's written. So right now I'm reading John Boyne's The Heart's Invisible Furies. He's an Irish author, and I literally savor every chapter. It's so beautifully wrought. He makes me laugh out loud. He paints a picture I can see very clearly. And his dialogue's amazing, but it pushes me harder as an author, and that's what I like to do. I like to be inspired in that way.
And speaking of being inspired, from Christine, who are your biggest literary inspirations?
Well, my first and probably my largest inspiration, and I remember when I read his my first novel of his was in college, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So although he writes, or he's in the past tense now, he wrote 100 Years of Solitude, Love in the Time of Cholera. When I read 100 Years of Solitude in college, I remember the chapter in which he writes about a character by the name of Maurizio Babylona, who was this man who, as he walked down the streets, Garcia Marquez describes how he had suspended yellow butterflies fluttering above his head and at his fingertips, so that it almost looked like he had this golden halo, but it was created through butterflies. And after he dies, his love, while she walks down the streets, all of a sudden the butterflies start following her. And what you learn later on is that the butterflies were actually, he was a house painter. They were attracted to the smell of paint on his skin, and because his scent is still lingering on her own skin, the butterflies walk down the street with her. And I remember reading that. I remember exactly where I was. I was on campus under a tree reading those pages, and I thought to myself, if he can make me believe that this is possible by writing this so poetically and beautifully and visually, anything is possible in fiction. And that sense of liberation, this sense that you could create a man that could walk down the street with fluttering butterflies at his fingertips and behind his head, was so strong with me that there have been times that when I'm writing, I think back and I think, well, why can't I write this? Anything is possible.
And then we have a few questions about your writing process itself. So John wants to know exactly that. What is your writing routine? And Sage, our audience, wants to know, do you prefer writing on a laptop or with a pen, paper? What is it like?
Okay, so my writing process, the physical aspect of it starts from the minute my children get on the bus till the time they come home. So that's probably from about 8 till 3 in the afternoon. I'm a very slow writer. I often begin my day by rewriting what I wrote the day before. I often read it out loud so I can hear how it sounds, because cadence is very important to me, and I can hear whether there's a word that's not quite right, or a beat too much, or something that needs to be inserted that way. So I recraft what I wrote the day before, and then I start writing something new. But it's a constant, I do work on a word processor because I'm constantly adjusting, the sentences and sort of smoothing them and making sure that they recreate what I see in my head, because every chapter for me is like a mini canvas that I want you to step into and to see and to feel and to immerse yourself in. So recreating that, to me, it takes a long time. I know there are a lot of authors who they just like to get to the end and then they go back and shape it, but I can't get to the next part until I feel what's behind me is as perfect as it can be. So that's my process. And some days, I should also say, I actually end up writing nothing. I spend the whole day deleting more than I've written. And so again, it's that craft.
I mean, I had authors telling me they delete, like you said, more stuff than they've written the day before. And they get really frustrated because they're like, now I'm back to square one. Or
for me, I imagine it the way, when you look at a Van Gogh painting and you see that he took his palette knife and in all that thick paint, he carved out the white of the canvas beneath it, and so that's the brushwork kind of then sort of bubbles forth and is much more impactful. That's why when I'm deleting things, certain sentences then come out in higher relief. So to me, it's actually pleasurable to find that. Where do I bring the light into the page and that breath so it's not so super saturated? I love that. And
instead of painting terms.
So instead of feeling frustrated that I didn't write as much on that day, I actually feel lighter and I feel there's greater clarity. So I think it's the spin, like how do you feel at the end of the day? Does the story get better? The themes get richer. It's important.
Okay. And then...
and I should add to the Sage who asked, I obviously cannot do that writing up on the pen and paper, so it's all on word processor and on a laptop for the most part.
Okay. Sydney wants to know, what's your favorite thing about being a writer? And Joey wants to know, what's a piece of advice you would give to aspiring writers?
Okay, so the most wonderful thing about a writer, again, is the fact that every novel is new and has different challenges, and I learn something new from each book that I write. I love having a creative life. I love having a place to put all these thoughts that bog down my head often, and to explore different characters. I mean, I love writing from the viewpoint of a man or a child or someone from a different culture. And researching that and making, doing oral interviews. I've been interviewing war refugees. I've been interviewing veterans, going to Ireland, going to Vietnam, all these places for this new book. For me, I'm very grateful to have a life where that changes with every project. Of course, it's not without its own perils. You take risk with different books and trying to, different things and hoping that your readership grows and that your readership that you've had in the past wants to read your next book. But I do think it's a wonderful life because, learning is a wonderful thing, and learning from other people is a wonderful thing.
So when you go interview these people, obviously, whether or not you can find these people, that depends on a lot of other things than yourself, because you could just find them, but they may not agree to it. How do you convince them to talk to you?
Well, with every book that I write, I cast my net very wide, and I start telling everyone that I know what I'm writing about. And then inevitably there are people who say, you have to meet my friend this person, or you have to, talk to this person. And usually through a point of introduction, people are willing to talk, with me. When I did the book The Lost Wife, which is about an artist who survives the Holocaust, I was lucky enough to go to the Holocaust Museum, and there's a whole oral history archive of people who were willing to share their stories of how they endured and survived the Holocaust. And so I could use that as a resource, as well as interview people who knew other survivors. And I went to Prague and I interviewed people, artists who had been in concentration camps and had learned how they were able to use stolen supplies. But it builds, you get a working foundation, and then you also have to have the confidence to reach out and to show that you have a genuine interest in getting everything right. It's so important for me to make sure that every detail is correct, that I think that comes across, that my interests are purely out of a desire to share correct knowledge, let's say.
Did you have a translator?
Sometimes I do have translators,
you have to hire a translator?
Yes, sometimes I have to hire, and sometimes there's just some nice person who just wants to be in hot pursuit of getting
are you afraid? Because I don't know, if I were to interview another person in a foreign language that I don't speak, I would afraid some of the content gets lost in translation.
I actually did have that happen once, where I felt that, it was for my book, The Last Van Gogh, where I had learned from someone in the village of Auvers-sur-Oise, where Vincent van Gogh spent his last 70 days of his life under the care of Dr. Gachet, that there was an old woman in her 90s who actually was alive when Marguerite Gachet was alive and knew, stories about the family. And the head of the tourist agency said if I came back another time, she'd set up a luncheon and we could meet and talk to her about what her memories were of Marguerite Gachet. But I didn't know that she was also working on her own book, that for like 30 years that she was, keeping in her living room. And when I started asking questions, you could tell there were things that she didn't want to say because she wanted to save them sometimes for her own book. And then it was just I could see on the translator's face she was trying to answer the questions politely, but maybe the woman wasn't answering them as politely. So sometimes you have that, but I've never felt that it impacted the actual research.
Okay. And just, I would love to go to that village. That I've never been there, but I would love to go. I have a comment from Kathy about your book on Vietnam. Will look forward to your book about Vietnam. Very interested in all things at this time period. When I was starting my adult life, my husband served, and we were separated for a year while he was there.
Okay, wonderful. I'm so glad.
You already have fans. And we have a question from Alice, and this is a question we don't usually talk about on the show, but I think it's a very important one, which is how were you able to find a publisher? Was it difficult? What was the process like?
So, as I mentioned before, I started writing right out of college. So I think one of the things when I look back to my writing career is that I knew so little about publishing. I didn't even realize how hard it is to get an agent or to get published. I was sort of blindly like, I'm writing my, my novel. So I wrote to 4 agents, sending 20 pages of my manuscript. This is back in the time where you didn't electronically submit. You had to send 20 pages in a self-addressed envelope and hope that the assistant reading the slush pile would read your 20 pages and pass it on to the agent. So that did happen. 2 agents were given my 20 pages, asked for the rest of the manuscript. And long story short, I've been working with my agent for 20 years, and she is the one who sells my book to the publisher and negotiates the contract for that. So that's how I got started. But I did not know anyone in publishing. It really was
Basically,
throwing it into the universe.
It's possible.
It is possible. Although I know now with email, and my agent said she could get 1,000 submissions a week, so people, just like college, can apply, to send their stuff so easily now through the internet that it's not as this manual submitting that took time.
Okay. And then Shirley wants to know your book, The Paris Wife?
The Lost Wife?
The Lost Wife, right, is becoming a movie. Can you talk about that process? How did you shop around?
Okay, so I do have a film agent, which is lovely to have someone who is, hoping to connect your novel with people who are potentially interested in adapting it to film. And the film is being produced by 3 wonderful producers. One of them is named Robbie Brenner, who did Dallas Buyers Club, Jeff Waxman, Michelle Hiddick-Soa, and Mark Klein has done the script, and so now they're casting it. It's been a wonderful process because I have a fantastic team who is really dedicated to seeing this, made into a movie. But just like every author who's had, had an option or had a book go into development, there's a lot of different pieces that go into getting a movie made, and it's a very costly affair. And so getting everything to come together, getting the right chemistry in the cast, it's, for me as a novelist, I'm the one composing everything and putting it onto the laptop. There's so many things now. So I just sitting back and letting them do their job and hoping, the script is beautiful, that it'll be a beautiful movie.
Did you get to adapt the
No,
script, like part of
no,
it?
no,
They
someone
totally
yeah,
had
yeah,
somebody else to do
yes.
it, and you were okay with it.
I was okay with it. It's a very difficult movie to adapt because there's 2 time periods and it goes back and forth in time. But the screenwriter, Mark Klein, did such an amazing job. He used images that I wrote into the novel as sort of transitional pieces. So when my character Lenka is in Theresienstadt painting, she takes her paintbrush and she's cleaning the brush in a jar of water, and as the tornado of paint transforms from red into clear or reddish liquid, it then goes to a scene in the book where there's the sinking of a boat, and there was a character in a red dress, and as she drowns in the water, I had described it like a drowning rose. So he used that sequence, splitting it, pulling from the book, in a way that I would have never thought. And also there's a lot of voiceover where he pulled language from it. So it really preserves the integrity and the images and the essence of what the book is about.
I mean, do you see in the art of movie making and the art of painting and the art of writing, how interchangeable are they?
Oh, it's a great question. It's a wonderful question. What I find fascinating as a novelist is to see how each medium can translate that story, the essence and the colors and the movement and the characters, and bring it to life. So in a novel, you're really able to do a lot of the inner workings of the character's mind, but you can't have that in a book, in a movie. So how do you bring that to life, still encapsulate who that character is? All those different ways, whether you're writing or you're visualizing or producing a movie, it's creating a world that either the audience or the reader or the person in front of that painting is pulled into and is interested in. And like a dance, that you're interacting and receiving that information and translating it in your mind and wanting to follow along. So it's almost like creating this invisible thread that tethers you to the story. And hopefully, again, just the same way when I say, when you get to the last page of my book, hopefully you've learned something new. It's the same feeling as when the credits roll up in a film, and you're left with that feeling of, wow, I just was taken on a journey, and I learned something.
Yeah, I didn't waste my 2 hours.
And I'm different. I'm a different person after this movie than I was when I sat down, or I'm different after I finished seeing that exhibit. Just the same way music can transform us, that it awakens something us. I think artists really want to ignite something in us so that we don't feel static, that we feel that we're alive, that that we're in this beautiful world, and there's so much to learn from each other. And I think that's how I see what I do, because I know every person who comes into my life when I'm writing a book leave something, and as I described it before, as a seed that will later sprout as I write that book. For me, at the end of when I'm an old woman, I hope that I'm a garden of all these different people that I've met, and then I'm able to share it with my readers.
Okay. All right, that's all the questions I have so far from you guys. Before I let you go, tell us where can people find you online? What's your social media?
Yes, what's my social media? I'm so embarrassed. I don't know if I know my handles by heart. You can certainly follow me on Instagram at my name, which is just at Alyson, ALYSON, RICHMAN. I believe my Facebook handle is at Alyson Richmond Author. And then there might be a / The Lost Wife, but I'm not sure. But if you do a search on Alyson Richmond Author, and then I'm not on Twitter very much. I answer it more, to just sort of say thank you if people write nice things. But again, it's just at my name, Alyson, ALYSON. Richmond, Richman, and I do have a website, which is just my name. I don't want to spell it for a fourth time. Hopefully you're all very smart and can spell, but it's just my name.com. And there's a contact sheet that people can always write to me directly.
Cool. And then an encore question, just for me, since you write about history. Obviously, history is very important. We all know in theory it is very important. The one pearl of history that, in my opinion, is sometimes, unfortunately, even if you know exactly what happened before, it doesn't prevent you from making the same mistake in the future. So in that case, I mean, I have my take on this, but in that case, what is the point of learning about history?
That's such a great question, and I think because those of us who do study history see that it is a pattern of mistakes being made time and time again. Often you're left with sort of this sickened feeling like this is inevitable that this is going to now follow in this trajectory and it's not going to be good. But I think it's the same what happens with children when you say, don't touch the flame, you're going to get burned, until you touch the flame and you get burned and then you never forget. So it's almost as though people need to sort of experience this in order to feel that impact personally, and then to realize, what has been done incorrectly or what is wrong. But there are definitely patterns to history and how things inevitably do repeat themselves.
And then you still think, in that case, it is better to study history. I mean, in your case,
for me,
I would say...
I don't know if I may... I mean, this is a complicated question. I don't want to be political, but I think that having studied history, having studied World War II and seeing what led up to certain things happening before actually things got as bad as they did. If you look at the 30s before the 40s, there were certain patterns happening. And so you can now look in different present-day times and see sort of patterns happening as well. And it's almost like you're driving and you see the end of the cliff and thinking we're headed in this direction unless we change before it gets to that point. So I'm not a fortune teller. I can't say that it inevitably will end the same way, but I definitely, studying history, you see that there's definitely a pattern.
All right. Is there anything else you want to tell us about your book, about anything you're working on?
I think it's been a wonderful interview.
Okay.
I'm just so grateful for the readers who came to listen. And you can always add questions afterwards. I can always, I'm sure, answer them.
Yeah,
but,
just leave us comments. I mean,
yeah,
you guys
comments.
You
but
guys know the drill.
Thank you for being curious, and thank you for reading.
All right. Thank you so much, Alyson.